They include energy ministers, EU and OPEC leaders, and experts on governance, environment, technology, and each key energy province in the world. Our great hope is that with the help of this audience, we can contribute to true energy security integrated into a new and effective foreign policy. Let me, before concluding, recognize another very important player in the development of this book, and that's the editor of the Wilson Center Press, Joe Brindley. If you don't mind standing up, Joe, I'd like to thank you on behalf of all the authors and the contributors to the book. David will be introducing our contributors in just a moment, but I want to acknowledge someone without whom I could not have imagined undertaking this project, my soulmate and wife, Jean Kalitsky. Jean. Now I am very, very pleased to introduce my good friend and partner and co-editor, David Goldwyn.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you all for coming. I also want to talk a little bit more about why we wrote this book and what we hope it will accomplish. Originally, we hoped it would come out during the last election cycle in order to influence U.S. policy, but I think that's not always the time for rational discussion, and so things are well-timed now. One of our primary reasons for writing this book was to sound an alarm. I mean, you would think at this point in our history that we would not need to suffer another catastrophe like 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina in order to muster the political will to take preventive action for foreseeable dangers. But if we don't start to treat energy security as a national security problem instead of just an economic problem, then we are looking at a kind of catastrophe, I think, in our future. And that catastrophe is going to be the erosion of our national power, our ability to project our influence and our values overseas, and the ability to maintain the alliances that we've maintained since the war. I think it's probably well settled now, but worth repeating that our blindness to the consequences, the political consequences of our energy consumption over the years has had grievous injury to our country. It's not only ours, but also our friends and allies, and it has led us into a foreign policy where we have defended countries and defended leaders and policies and ignored conduct by those leaders, which has resulted in enormous hatred against the United States and tremendous destruction and instability in all regions of the world. So we've been able to obtain the energy that we need, but not the security that we have to have. And as Jan has said and Dan has said, energy security is not about cheap gasoline. Energy security is about maintaining our national power. And right now, we are more energy insecure than we have been probably at any time since 1973. Adam Szyminski talks about it in the first chapter, but 20 years from now, we will be as dependent on oil and a little bit more on gas than we are today. And we're going to need more of that oil from OPEC. We're going to need more of that oil and then a little bit more gas from countries that are increasingly unstable. And they're going to be unstable because they are led by corrupt or repressive or autocratic regimes, or some cases, as Luis Tejas talks about in his chapter on Mexico, countries that are just paralyzed by their own internal politics. The market, which has been our friend for energy development, is already dominated by a cartel, but as Jan referred to, the market itself is increasingly under attack or increasingly closed. State control is rising in places like Russia and also Venezuela, which means that our ability to access oil is decreasing. And international oil companies, as some of my colleagues know better than others, are increasingly competing with non-market economies who are able to offer aid packages and infrastructure which only an entity with a zero cost of capital can produce. We can't compete with that, or at least we're not prepared to compete with it now. And the building blocks of our energy defenses, the SPR, the International Energy Agency's comprehensive response, are all defenses built to fight the war of 1973 and not the threats of 2005. Because today what we're looking at is threats that come from internal instability in countries. Lack of spare capacity not only in oil and gas, but obviously in electricity and in products, and soon in natural gas. We're looking at price volatility and the threat of terrorism, and we can't deter those with an SPR. We've also failed to invest in the defenses that we ought to have today to defend ourselves. We're not prepared for an act of terrorism against our power grid. If something were to have happened in the Gulf Coast, if that was an act of terrorism, not a hurricane, and we weren't able to access the pipelines, we would have no energy defenses at all. And so we have put all of our eggs in one basket. And more importantly, because we're talking about foreign policy, we haven't invested in the diplomacy to try and prevent or deter or at least remediate the instability that exists in Central Asia, in Russia, in Africa, and other places. So our national power right now is already eroding. And Jan referred to a number of cases where we've seen it. We saw it with smart sanctions, our inability to get those in Iraq even before the war. We see it in Sudan, we see it in Russia, we see it in China. We see it in our waning influence in Asia and in Latin America. And so as Dan Yergin referred to, we're all in this together. We're going to need global solutions for these problems. We're going to have to cure Asian and European dependency because there is no energy independence for ourselves and there's no energy security for ourselves. It's got to work for everybody. If our allies are vulnerable, then we're vulnerable. And I think Jan and I were disappointed but realistic in realizing that there are no quick solutions. We're talking about managing the next 20 years. And if we start now and we're very aggressive and we start on a new path, we may be in a different place in 20 years, but we'll be stuck with the same suppliers and some of the same problems between now and then. And we've got to manage our way through those problems with probably only incremental changes in our consumption patterns. But we organized this book because we thought that we, the United States, could undertake a different course, that we could be in a more secure place 20 years from now than we are today. And we believe that in this country we have the vision and the ingenuity and the financial resources, and in many cases, as Dr. Moniz will talk about, the technology to fashion these solutions. What we've lacked so far is the leadership on both sides of the aisle to try and explain to people what it is we have to do and how we should go about it. And when we organized this book, we organized it first as a resource, and Jan referred to the diversity of views here, because lots of smart people think different things. But the one thing they all agree on is that the status quo is unacceptable. And so we organized this first so we could provide our leaders and leaders abroad with these views. But we also organized it so we could put forth our own views on what we think the country ought to do and why. And we do that in the beginning, at the end, and we'll get to some of that today. But for this privilege of being able to present our views to the public and to present the views of our contributors to the public, I join Jan in saying we're very grateful to the Wilson Center Press and to the Johns Hopkins University Press for enabling us to put this out at this critical time. I want to thank our friends in Norway for supporting the book. And I want to thank all of our contributors also, and a number of them are here today. Melanie Kenderdine, who wrote the chapter with Dr. Moniz. I see John Elkind in the back as well. We're expecting Luis Tejas and Madame de Palacio. And Julian Ané will be here as well. Because these are all people who work in this field. They all have very heavy responsibilities. And they gave us original product, well-researched, during their vacations, and with tremendous demands from us, and we're grateful to them for contributing to the book and for what they contribute to the field as well. Since a number of them are here, I also want to thank my mentors who enabled me to be where I am today to write on this, colleagues I learned from at the State Department who taught me every day, my wife Kathy, who's a real academic, who told me you have to be patient and editing is good for you. Kathy, where are you? Bring Benjamin back in here. And that editing is good for your soul and good for your book. And I want to thank my son Benjamin for sleeping through his first, some of the mornings, his first few weeks of life, and letting me edit my share of the manuscript. But last and mostly, I want to thank my good friend Jan Kalitsky for having the inspiration to prepare this book, and for his unflagging good humor, and for his patience with his often very less patient colleague. Because it's made writing this book, which has taken us 2 years, and gathering, not writing it, but editing it, gathering things together, a great source of pride, but also a great pleasure. So thank you. So enough from me. On to our panels. Thank you very much.
Very fine.
Ernie, will you join us?
I'll let you stay here. I'll go over.
Okay, great. All right. Amy's going for it. Yeah, she's going to go first. She's on the line? Great. All right. In the first of these two panels today, we're going to talk about the key drivers of the energy system. And we're going to focus on two of these key drivers in particular. One is the power and conduct of OPEC and the rise of China as an energy importer. And then we're going to talk about two tools for our responses. One is investing wisely in technology, and the other is modernizing our strategic reserves. We're going to begin with Amy Myers-Jaffe, who's on the phone. Hi, Amy.
Hey, how are you, David?
Good, thanks. Amy was going to be with us here in person, but for some personal reasons, she was unable to. But we've got her wired in on the phone. And Amy was an extremely important contributor to to the book. She co-authored 2 chapters, one with Ed Morse on OPEC and confrontation with globalization, and the second with Ken Medlock on China and Northeast Asia. She's well known to everybody in the energy field. She's the Wallace Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies at the James A. Baker III Center for Public Policy at Rice, and the Associate Director of the Energy Program at Rice, and the author of many of her own works. After Amy speaks, we're going to turn to Dr. Moniz, former Undersecretary of Energy, Professor of Physics and Director of Energy Studies at the Laboratory for Energy and the Environment at MIT. He's a former deputy in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and also an accomplished physicist and author. And then we'll have time for questions and answers. So, Amy, let's start with you. We can all hear you very clearly, so take it away.
Great. Well, I make allusions to your opening statement where you talked about OPEC and a lot of the risks being external and seeming a bit out of our control. I mean, the big theme has been that OPEC has not continued to make the kind of investments they needed to make to keep up with the rise in global demand. We've all probably heard ad nauseum post the Unocal acquisition that China's energy demand has been rising dramatically and is expected to continue to do so, and that's going to put additional pressure on the oil market. I always feel the need to throw in the point that the United States rise in oil use, which is about 3% a year, is also dramatically high, maybe higher than a burden on the market than the Chinese growth. And so I always throw out the statistic before I start hashing about China, which is that in the decade from 1990 to 2000, the rise in U.S. imports, that's just our rise in imports, not our total imports, our rise in imports represented 30% of the total global increase in tradable oil, that is oil moving from one country to another, and it represented about 60% of the increased sales that OPEC got during that period. So we can talk about the challenge that the emerging economies of China and India are going to present, and they certainly are going to present those. But we will not be standing diplomatically from a strong position if we're unable to have an effective energy policy inside the United States to deal with the Chinese and other parties like that in talking to them about a global system response. We are facing a situation that is really pretty unique from 1973, and that's because in 1973 we had 3.5 million barrels a day of spare capacity in OPEC. So if we had an extraordinary Secretary of State and we could fly him around to oil-producing countries, we could get them to change their mind and increase production. That is not possible today because the countries of OPEC are pretty much producing flat out, and the one or two countries that aren't, maybe there's some technical constraints on the quality of their oil, or otherwise there really just isn't a lot of volume out there to call upon. The second thing is that we had much higher commercial stocks in 1973 held by private companies that they could use if there was a crisis or a disruption to supply their customers for a period of time. In the United States, we operate at very lean levels today compared to 1973, which I think Katrina proved, as those of you who live up and down the eastern seaboard. And then also, we were operating at something like between 65 and 70% of refining capacity worldwide. And so if you could find the extra crude somewhere, there was no problem turning it into the products we need to go about our daily lives. And again, that is no longer true today. So the challenges that we face, and I only have another minute or two to keep talking, so I'll try to wrap it up. The challenges that we face in trying to cooperate with China, in trying to avoid OPEC getting even more market power and using that to political gain, are even greater because we are facing much more dire capacity constraints to deal with any kind of surprise than in 1973. So that certainly behooves us to think about joint policies, joint global policies, and this sort of peril mindset that developed during the debate over whether or not a Chinese state-owned company should be able to buy an American company i.e. Unocal, really exaggerated the issues. It's not that we won't necessarily have to compete with China for scarce fuel someday. I mean, I suppose you could come up with a scenario where that's going to happen. But the question about whether China really poses a threat to the United States, whether it's that their Navy would go out and force ships to China or the kinds of scenarios one would imagine, they would invade a Middle East country or something like that, that's not realistic today in China's military capabilities. And so you need to step back from your fears about what could happen in 30 or 40 years and think about the fact that we have time to engage China in a dialogue at the highest level about coping with OPEC and coping with the structural problems we see now in the energy market. We are in a very tenuous situation. I mean, just think about the current market and imagine OPEC standing up today, which they don't seem inclined to do, but they could, announcing that they are not getting a fair price for their commodity and they think they'll raise the price and cut production instead of increasing production to try to ease the market. Or if you had a little block of countries, even a single country inside OPEC, stand up and say, we don't like U.S. foreign policy. Unless you change the following thing, we're going to take 1 million barrels a day off the market. The leverage that they would have today versus 5 years ago or 10 years ago is really high because the market is so high and so tight. So it really does become a matter of national security. It really isn't just about what Americans who drive Hummers are willing to pay to fill their tank. It's also about whether the United States in the diplomatic arena will be able to manage if a oil producer were to try to step up and try to gain a political leverage. And the best way to prevent that is our alliance with the other OECD countries through the emergency stockpiling system and having a dialogue with some of the countries that aren't involved in that system, a la China, at the highest of levels for coordination. So if you can imagine if the United States had announced we're releasing our strategic petroleum reserve as we did to cope with Katrina, and we had a very successful initiative from the White House to get petroleum products aid from Europe, right, to make up for the loss of refining capacity, which everyone's hoping will be temporary, but the jury's still out on some of the facilities. If during that time, China stood up and said, well, we don't agree and we have to worry about people in China, so we are going to buy 2 million barrels a day of extra oil right now to make sure that our economy is not affected, then that would completely countermand anything we could do by releasing stocks. And, of course, the Chinese didn't do that, but we need to make sure that we're in a situation where we continue to work together so that we don't have some massive market failure. So with that, I think I'll leave that as sort of a stage setter, and we can, after the panel's done, we can discuss some of these issues more.
Terrific. Thanks, Amy. Dr. Moniz, I think we have your slide on the
slide.
On the slide that we can, I think we can project on the screen, and there was also a chart that we put out on the table outside that some of you may have.
Thanks, David. Clearly, there are many intersections of energy, technology, and policy issues with important security concerns. In fact, the slide along the left-hand column lists 4 of those areas. First, of course, is that which is the principal focus of the book and of today's discussions, namely the issues raised by having supply and demand centers for oil in such dramatically different and distant parts of the world. And as natural gas becomes more and more a global commodity, similar issues arising for natural gas. A second issue is the security implications of climate change. The concern is ultimately about the displacement of water resources, agriculture, diseases, and people. And of course, indeed, Katrina reminded us of the devastation and humanitarian and security issues that can arise from nature's occasional violent outbursts of a type that is likely to become more commonplace with global warming. A third issue is concerned about further nuclear weapons proliferation stemming from possible major spread of nuclear fuel cycle technology, perhaps in response to climate change. And fourth is the need to protect critical energy infrastructures that move more and more energy over large distances, both high energy density targets and extended networks needing protection. Today, we'll focus on the first two of these, the oil-gas supply-demand issues and climate change. And the reason I include the latter is to make the point, as we will discuss, that the technology and policy responses are remarkably similar for both of these security challenges. This, of course, should in principle offer hope for advancing the synergistic policy agenda, but of course, by observation, this hasn't happened yet, as the energy security agenda, in some sense, deals with the realities of the commitment to markets as our core energy principle, not to mention geological realities of U.S. oil and gas resources, and as the climate change agenda wrestles with a combination of denial and no really good ideas about how to bring in advanced developing economies, such as China, into a climate mitigation regime. In any case, all of these security challenges, all four of them, in fact, call for significant actions facilitated by advanced technologies and really over the next decade. But of course, this has been true for quite some time already, the need for action over a decade. Now, the question posed by the organizers for this discussion is, can technology buy us energy security? Where, again, energy security I take in this generalized sense as the slide portrays. Well, if the emphasis is on can technology buy us energy security, the answer is very clearly yes. In fact, we have all the technologies in hand today to accomplish all of these objectives inherent in these challenges. More interesting questions really are, will this happen and when will it happen? These technologies that we will be addressing are not in sufficiently widespread use today to buy us energy security or to significantly mitigate climate change because, as a rule, they are more expensive, certainly in capital cost and, for the most part, in lifetime levelized cost as well. A major exception to the latter perhaps being a number of efficiency technologies which do deliver lifetime economic benefit. But with neither of these public goods, energy security or climate change mitigation, internalized in energy prices, a competitive market will obviously seldom choose the more expensive technology, especially if it entails putting more capital at risk and a concomitant difficulty in attracting investor interest. So in moving on to mention briefly then some of the technology pathways of most interest for these two challenges, let me repeat the first message. The technologies exist today to address energy security and climate change mitigation, and indeed, the technologies are largely the same. In the absence of policies that internalize the costs of public goods, security, and climate change mitigation, these technologies generally cost more than the alternative. Third, the technology development will continue to lower the costs, hopefully, therefore, lowering the policy barriers as well. And fourth, the government has a role to play in supporting research, development, demonstration, and deployment in a well-managed portfolio of technology developments, but overall the history of 30 years at IRDA and DOE is at best mixed. So let's move on to some of the technologies to address these oil, gas, and climate change challenges. And I'd like to again acknowledge my co-author, Melanie Kenderdine, Vice President of Gas Technology Institute, with whom we worked long and hard on this paper because of David and Jan. Also, I've mentioned that Melanie is another of the DOE colleagues up to noon on January 20th, 2001. I'll organize my comments around two key sectors: transportation and its associated fuels, essentially oil, and power, which of course has a growing demand for natural gas worldwide. First, for transportation. There are fundamentally four basic technology pathways. First, advanced high-efficiency vehicles that reduce oil demand. Most prominently today, of course, we have the hybrid gasoline or diesel electric hybrids. This technology, fundamentally in hand, has a clear potential for doubling, let's say roughly, fuel efficiency of vehicles at modest cost in a relatively short term. But there's a caution as well that we already see, a reliving of the history with CAFE standards, in which once, in a certain sense, the objective in terms of efficiency is achieved, technology continues to improve. But in both cases, that is in the CAFE history since 1985, and now in the beginning, beginning with hybrids, without further policy constraints, the technology increases are invested in enhanced performance of the vehicle as opposed to enhanced efficiency. So again, we have certainly more to do, reducing costs, improving performance to reach, let's say, this doubling, but policy is a major barrier to the introduction, an introduction which in fact saves a lot of oil. A second technology pathway, of course, is to find, in quotes, new sources of oil. Enhanced recovery from existing oil fields. We forget that only a third of the oil is actually taken out from existing fields. A lot of new technology is and can improve that using advanced sensors, advanced communication techniques, etc. And of course, heavy oil and tar sands already developing 1 million barrels a day in Canada, but still lots of room for improvement. As one example, microbial approaches to improving the flow of heavy oil. A third technology pathway, alternatives to oil, compressed natural gas vehicles, natural gas to liquids, coal to liquids, biofuels. Again, all of these exist today. There is, of course, a price issue, but if today's oil prices were viewed as confidently sustained, I'm not advocating it, but if that were the case, for example, all the technologies I just mentioned would in fact be competitive and make you money today. It does not change the fact that technology development to lower those prices further, to decrease environmental damage in some cases, is in fact very important. I'll mention, for example, in coal to liquids, one of the issues there is coal gasification. It's basically changing coal into a refinery business, like oil. Well, today, there are 12 major gasifiers being built in China, for example, to make ammonia. This is a technology that is not exactly, has to be invented. And the fourth pathway would be what I would call infrastructure transformation. The most obvious example of that is the hydrogen economy, especially for transportation. In contrast to the first three, this is a pathway that in any real sense does not exist today and needs substantial R&D to be credible. However, I want to caution, one should not accept at face value the inevitability of the hydrogen transportation infrastructure. It is far from the case. And these are not only technical issues, well, ultimately they are technical issues, fuel cell costs, supply and infrastructure and storage, but I just want to emphasize that while it is important to maintain research and development in hydrogen, it is by no means the place that we will end up, as opposed to, for example, advanced, perhaps plug-in hybrids, as an example. A point I want to make in terms of the government's portfolio is that today, the government R&D portfolio is very heavily skewed towards emphasizing number 4 as opposed to number 1, 2, and 3. And number 4 is the one that will certainly have no impact on energy security issues for several decades. You figure. So what about transportation and climate change? Now, the other security driver that I mentioned. Very quick. Number 1, advanced efficiency. Great for climate change. Number 2, alternative sources of oil. Not an issue for climate change. Number 3, alternatives to oil. Gas, biofuels, perfect for climate change. And hydrogen, if made from renewable sources, of course, would also be relevant. So again, emphasizing another message. The technology and policy pathways for addressing these first two security challenges are very, very similar, and one would hope that synergy can move us forward. Now, of course, in talking about natural gas as an alternative, be it through compressed natural gas vehicles or through natural gas to liquids, as a possible solution on the oil side, does raise the issue of natural gas supply and possibly raising the same issues. And this, of course, in general terms, raises the issue of technology development for monetizing stranded gas. As you know, a large fraction of our natural gas resources globally are stranded, and those are the resources that we must be able to use at reasonable cost be it LNG or be it GTL, et cetera, if we are to use the natural gas as part of this transportation solution. Now, natural gas naturally then leads us to the power sector, the second area. I'll be much briefer here. Again, what are the technology pathways in terms of the natural gas issues? Well, number one, again, the same, efficiency. Use less natural gas to accomplish your goals. And that's true both for electricity supply and also on the demand side, especially buildings, another area where government policy could have a huge impact on our use of a fossil resource, and frankly, one of the cases where you can probably actually even make money over a long enough time period. And a special case of efficiency in natural gas use that we in the United States lag dramatically behind others in is the use of combined heat and power, where system efficiencies of 70-80% are available today, but in fact are being utilized very, very sparsely in the United States, partly because of our unresolved regulatory situation in the power sector. Now, once again, there are alternatives to natural gas in the power sector: nuclear, wind, coal, all of which have challenges in the public dimension right now. We could go through them, obviously: safety, waste, proliferation, nuclear, et cetera. But I think you're quite familiar with those. And third, there is the question of, again, greater supply of natural gas. One area in which there has been motion in the recent energy bill discussions is the establishment of a royalty trust fund to look at ultra-deep 10,000 feet of water and beyond, perhaps natural gas production. Gulf of Mexico expected to have large reserves in those deep waters, and also onshore unconventional gas resources like coal bed methane, in which we have over the last 20 years developed and applied technology to produce a trillion cubic feet per year source domestically with much more potential. The National Petroleum Council in '99 predicted around 4 trillion cubic feet additional U.S. supply could come from a 10 to 15 year technology development program for onshore unconventional supplies. And of course, also on greater supply, we mentioned the key role of stranded gas. So things like LNG, for example, developing economic alternatives for small fields, developing new technologies for things like the Alaska pipeline would be very, very important for accessing stranded gas. Climate change driver, all the same technologies with one exception. In the issue of coal as an alternative to natural gas in the supply sector, in the electricity supply sector, the only exception is then, of course, for climate change, you must also capture and sequester the carbon dioxide. Otherwise, the technology pathways are identical. So finally, just to summarize some of the steps inherent in what we've been discussing, one is that DOE does need to better institutionalize a transparent energy research and development portfolio process that is critically organized around the strategic objectives of security and climate. Secondly, a constant theme, all these objectives. Efficiency is where we can get the biggest bang for the buck and the quickest. And for this to work, what we need to do is something we have not done, and that is align our regulatory advances with technology advances. CAFE standards are a good example. Essentially, we stopped with the standard in 1985. At that time, until today, the fleet efficiency for, let's say, a given automobile class has remained the same, but the engine power has more than doubled. That's where all the technology went. Third, we do need a renewed focus on oil and gas exploration and production, R&D appropriate to Western Hemisphere reservoirs. And as I said, there's been some progress on that with the Royalty Trust Fund and other initiatives. We very much need an alternative fuels program that goes beyond political imperatives to addressing the real issues for making biofuels useful. The recent energy bill did provide some broader incentives, production tax credits, et cetera, for carbon-free technologies. Strong. That's a positive move from this point of view. And finally, because of the role of coal in particular, whether it be for electricity production or potentially for producing liquid fuels, we very much need a serious carbon capture and sequestration technology program in the United States. We do not have one at the current time. Indeed, as coal gasification becomes popular without carbon capture, I mentioned the Chinese plants, for example, we should understand this is making the climate situation worse. It's fuel switching from natural gas to coal, which is the wrong direction for carbon. There are other issues with regard to nuclear and the infrastructure, but I think we'll just focus on those two today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ernie. That's terrific. Let me say just about make a few points about strategic reserves, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. Obviously, technology is one key solution, but our strategic reserves have historically been the major weapon that the United States and the IEA countries have had to combat an embargo or some kind of a threat. But I think what we have seen most dramatically with Hurricane Katrina, but what we could have seen in advance, is that we have not kept our strategic reserves up to date, or we have not kept them up to date with the challenges that we're facing in the 21st century. When the SPR was first created in 1975, as Amy alluded to earlier, refining capacity was abundant. Private companies held substantial inventories of crude and gasoline inventories, and we were worried about an embargo rather than a physical loss close to home. But as times have changed and consolidation in the industry has taken place, commercial inventories have moved to just-in-time inventories. And as we saw from Hurricane Katrina, we don't have the kind of stocks that we need to deal with problems that may happen closer to home, whether that's an act of terrorism or a hurricane. So let me outline sort of 5 vulnerabilities we have and 5 solutions. The first one, most obvious, is that we don't have strategic reserves of gasoline or jet fuel or diesel, and natural gas, as that increasingly becomes a fuel, will be something which we'll want to have reserves of. We're going to see this winter what the impact is of very short inventories of natural gas. Second, I think the hurricane also pointed out the danger of putting all of your resources in the Gulf Coast. Now, for efficiency purposes, it made sense to have our strategic petroleum reserve there. You had salt caverns, the pipelines are there. But if you're looking at what sorts of dangers that we might face, particularly ones that result in terrorism, then you might want to look at what will be an expensive but maybe an indispensable option, which is to put additional reserves in another part of the country, perhaps closer to the consumption centers in the Northeast. If something had happened to the pipelines in the Gulf Coast, then we would have had no security or protection at all. The third thing that's a vulnerability is that we don't actually have a formal process for using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And I think Melanie probably remembers well, you know, the ad hoc process that was created in 2000. The White House has a role, the Energy Department has a role. And we've seen in the most recent administration that ad hoc policy creates confusion. We had the Venezuelan strike in 2002, 2003. More than 7% of production was offline. We couldn't get a decision to use the reserve for a purpose for which it was originally created. We drew down our inventories, and people would argue we're paying the price ever since. And politics played a big role in that. You know, they didn't want to do what the previous administration did. The Energy Department was not empowered to set energy policy. And I think the lack of a formal policy is damaging to the market. In this market, psychology plays an important role. And if the signal to the market, as Vice President Cheney gave when he said, absent a strategic catastrophic attack on a major producer, we will not access our reserves. Well, the signal that gives to the market is that if there's a strike or there's a hurricane, the sky's the limit. There is no downside in this market. And that's not a sensible policy. So you have to talk about how you're going to use the reserve. And I think the final vulnerability, other than an ad hoc policy that we have, is that its current size, the SPR, is soon going to be too small. When it was created, we had 90 days of import cover. Now we've got about 60 days of import cover and maybe 30 days of total supply coverage. And as U.S. demand grows, and in fact as global demand grows, we're going to need a bigger reserve just to keep up the same number of days of import cover. So we need to start thinking about an additional reserve someplace anyway. So, and I would say a fifth vulnerability that isn't specific to the U.S. is that Asia, except for Japan and Korea, doesn't have strategic reserves. And you look at China in particular, and you can say, well, if there is a catastrophe someplace, they will get to be a free rider on the IEA strategic reserves because price will go down. But in a real crisis, where there was a supply shortage, they lack hard barrels. We've got ours at home. The IEA has theirs. And so China has legitimate insecurity. And so I think one of the things we need to look at is whether there ought to be a global strategic petroleum reserve governed by the IEA to which Asia could have access. And I'll talk a little bit about more on that in a minute. So what ought we do? I think first, I think we need a declaratory policy about how we're going to use the reserve that makes sense. Second, I think that we should use tax credits to encourage private companies to increase adequate inventories and create a distributed network of product reserves. Putting all of our eggs in one basket doesn't make sense. European countries do this, but I think a mandate is probably not the way to go, but incentives for companies to maintain inventories is a good idea. Third, I think the Energy Secretary needs to be empowered to manage the SPR. He needs to be able to manage it for short-term crises, needs to be able to manage it for disruptions close to home, and to provide flexible relief. There are cases when there's a disruption and Saudi Arabia will commit to send tankers of oil to help, and we can wait 60 days for them to get here. But why shouldn't the Energy Secretary be able to loan out that amount until the commercial supplies arrive? Why does the American economy have to take a hit the way we did with the Venezuelan strike, rather than having bridge relief, which is sitting on the Gulf Coast? So we need a rational policy for doing that. Fourth, we need to look at what size our additional reserves should be, both of crude oil and of products, and whether we ought to establish a reserve for natural gas. And the last thing that I alluded to was a kind of a global strategic petroleum reserve. And this would be to build tankage in Asia, maybe at demobilized bases in the Philippines, and perhaps sell special drawing rights to countries so that it could be self-financing, but to put real barrels into Asia and govern them by IEA rules so that if there was a disruption, that there would be barrels to provide relief. And that might be a step that we could take towards China and India that would provide them a real strategic reason to coordinate with us rather than compete with us when it comes to energy supplies overseas. All of these ideas are long-term ideas. No one wants to build reserves right now and take huge amounts of oil off the market and drive the price to $100. But energy is a business in which there's long lead times. And I think setting on a policy where over the next decade, we would pursue these kinds of options would be indispensable. So let me finish. I want to credit Michelle Billig, my co-author on this, who's not here today. He was another colleague at the Department of Energy and then at the Council on Foreign Relations, now at PIRA, for working on these ideas with me. And that's it for our presentations. Now we'll turn it over to questions and answers. We've left a good, solid 35 minutes. So let's open it to the floor. Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone, if you would, please. And
I have two questions. First is this. If transportation costs much of the energy usage, why there's still the political barrier to have a efficient vehicle? And second is this. You didn't mention about fusion. What's our policy in fusion?
Well, okay, let me start with the second one, fusion. I did not mention fusion for one thing because I have a 50-year time horizon, and fusion doesn't quite fit into there. Clearly, there is a major international collaboration to build a next generation reactor in France. The U.S. policy is to be a junior partner in that effort. We will provide around 10% of the funding is the current expectation. Don't get me wrong, I do agree in the need for the government to support fusion R&D as a very long-term, very high risk in terms of an actual energy system technology. With regard to the first question on efficiency standards for automobiles, the United States. Well, I mean, others can of course comment on this, but I think there are obviously, well, by definition, there have been very, very strong political forces aligned against an increase in efficiency standards. That is partly driven, of course, by what the high margin products out of Detroit have been. They are not ones that are easily amenable to stringent efficiency standards. Although I think there's another issue that's less often mentioned, and that is that in the United States, which after all does have a very diverse set of needs for its transportation vehicles, there are, I think, sharply different regional needs that I think have not been accommodated. In fact, CAFE standards, certainly given the alternative of doing nothing, much more stringent, increasing CAFE standards, I think, are essential for really impacting oil use. On the other hand, I really think we need to do a lot more focus on alternatives to CAFE standards to get, frankly, better instruments for increasing efficiency standards. CAFE standards are, in fact, very distortionary, if you like, for the manufacturers.
Down there.
But you should remind them that Amy, right? Isn't she?
Yeah. Should I jump in?
I have a question of David. You wanted to empower the Secretary of Energy regarding the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and the Secretary of Energy already has the authority to do a 30 million barrel exchange, which Secretary Richardson utilized, and which they're utilizing now, I believe, although it's been very fuzzy, that the current 30 million barrels that they're putting out onto the market is an exchange. The President called it a swap. Getting that swap done, even though the Secretary has the clear authority under the law to do that, requires moving mountains within any administration. So, because it is so politically charged. So I am not convinced that giving the Secretary that authority makes any difference whatsoever. It still becomes a highly, highly politicized decision, even when the Secretary has the authority. I personally think that moving the Strategic Petroleum Reserve Management into some kind of independent agency that functions independent of politics is a much better way to go, and just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Thanks for the question. I think as we elaborate a little bit more in the chapter, we're really talking about as a process that's very similar to the National Security Council process. Clearly, there are a lot of parties that want a seat at the table, but almost like an open market committee works for the Federal Reserve, talking about requiring the Secretary of Energy to lead a formal process whenever there is an emergency. And they might produce no decision, but basically they would be obliged to call that together and to push things through, and there would be some transparency, not in the deliberations, but in the obligation of the Energy Secretary to make recommendations to the President. I think part of the problem in the way the process has become politicized, sometimes it's the Treasury Department that speaks out, someone else, is that it looks like the President's making a political decision whenever he makes a move. But if the Energy Secretary is in a sense required to convene an interagency process, provide an analysis and provide recommendations, then the President is less boxed in than or more by a process, but less by the politics. Creating an independent agency like the Federal Reserve would be another way to do it, but it's hard to see giving up that strategic power to an independent agency. Gentleman in the middle was waiting, and then here.
Remind me about Amy.
Amy, jump in anytime if you want to participate in any of the answers on these.
No problem.
You said that carbon dioxide sequestration is an essential component for the efficient production of power. However, carbon dioxide sequestration can be very expensive. Some power companies have achieved sequestration by afforestation of desert land, such as in Central America. This would seem to be less expensive, and how feasible is it? There does seem to be a large amount of desert land in the world.
Yes. So the question is about carbon capture and sequestration, which, in particular for coal use, would be critical if we are carbon constrained. And the question is about essentially alternatives, such as essentially reforesting to capture carbon dioxide. This, of course, is being done as was correctly stated. And I might mention a second path is already being pursued, and that is for enhanced oil recovery, which up to now has been done principally with CO2 from natural reservoirs, but is now beginning to use captured CO2 as well. So both of these are feasible and real and happen today. However, to address the climate change issue, one needs to be capturing the order of 1 billion tons of carbon or 4 billion tons of CO2 per year to make a serious dent in the problem. To do that, neither of these approaches will be adequate. So they are fine for kind of getting going now, but it's clear one will need a very different reservoir structure to capture 1 billion tons of carbon per year. The most likely candidate, since most people, I think sensibly, are very leery of using the oceans, I am certainly very leery of using the oceans, feel that very deep saline aquifers are the geological structures that have the sufficient capacity and the integrity to do that. It remains a research issue to prove that out. I will just add one other thing. I don't want to imply that carbon sequestration on a large scale is going to be easy. And among the reasons for that is it's very simple to do the arithmetic and to understand that, for example, if you do want to capture 1 billion tons of carbon per year, CO2, carbon in CO2, and move it to a sequestration site, you are talking about building an infrastructure of moving around fluids, CO2, as large as today's global natural gas infrastructure. So we should understand there are science challenges, there are infrastructure challenges, there are huge liability challenges. Who owns the liability for CO2 stored underground for a long, long time? There are major challenges, but if coal is to play a role long-term in a carbon-constrained world, frankly, these must be addressed.
David, I'd like to sort of add on to Ernie's comment. There are some, I think, new areas of science, too, in enhancing...
One second, can we turn the volume up on Amy?
Yeah.
Enhancing technologies for allowing the soils to capture more carbon. And that's not an area that's like in vogue to talk about. We're doing some of that work here at Rice, so I'm more familiar with it than probably most people. But there are work that's been done in China, in cultivation technologies and so forth. So that's also an interesting area. But I totally agree with Ernie that when you look at the scale of what needs to be captured, if you really analyze it and you're honest with yourself, then you really have to be thinking about a long-term strategy to switch our energy system to fuels for which you don't have to capture a waste stream. And so, I could, throw out the same kind of statistics for how much nuclear waste one would have to be at a process to do the IPCC prediction for, nuclear power to take up the slack. So I really think the real tragedy, not only in this country, but even among our allies who are most aggressive, i.e. Japan and Germany and so forth, is that barely no attention goes into things like solar energy, distributed energy, battery storage, and the kinds of systems that it would take to have someday a non-coal-based future where we don't have to be capturing as much carbon because we're moving to a energy system that doesn't produce it.
I think, let me just add one comment to Amy's, which follows from it in a certain sense. Clearly, in the long term, for example, direct solar conversion in the very long term is the most attractive option, but that's a very long term. However, we talked earlier here about oil and gas having the inconvenient fact of the supply and the demand not being very well correlated. the next statement is, unfortunately, coal is correlated. The United States, China, India, the three largest countries in the world, all have lots of coal. And even if the United States, and I believe we will, be moving to some form of carbon control regime soon, China and India are entirely different issues. Last year, China brought online more than 40,000 megawatts of coal capacity for power. And so we have to address these issues of how coal is going to be used, at least in a transitional period, if we want to be serious about climate change.
Perfect. This gentleman here. Can you identify yourself, please?
Yes. Nick Berry, Foreign Policy Forum. A number of economists say that we shouldn't underestimate the market. Now, when petroleum reaches $100 a barrel, and gas at the pump is between $4 and $5.50, that, pardon the pun, this will energize both the private sector and the public sector to do what you have in the last two columns there. Isn't there a self-correcting mechanism that they talk about, the market?
Absolutely. As I, in fact, alluded, all of those oil alternatives are very, very economically competitive today if oil stays at the price where it's at. Part of the problem has always been that these are all large capital investment technologies as well, and the volatility of oil prices, looked at over a somewhat longer period of time than we are looking at it over the last few weeks, has been a very, very big detriment to making the kinds of large capital investments that are required and not having them stranded. Nevertheless, if you look today, get natural gas to liquids, lots of commitments are being made, growing that market very, very substantially, not in the United States, but elsewhere. Biofuels, frankly, wouldn't need a subsidy at today's oil prices. They do at $30 a barrel. Coal to liquids would be profitable somewhere in the competing against $40 to $50 per barrel oil today, even without technology improvements. So one of the problems is the market, on the one hand, given high oil prices, would bring in these technologies, but the market has to have some kind of signals of some type that economists should devise to protect against the volatility in the price.
Amy, do you want to jump in there and maybe mention something about oil sands as well?
Yeah, let me jump in and say the following things. I'm a big believer in the market. My first job in the energy business was to be the first person to write about the futures market. And we would definitely be in a worse situation if we didn't have market-based pricing and a clearing system with the kinds of challenges we're facing today. But I'm also aware of the fact that when I was a middle schooler, I had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to sit with my father at the one gasoline station that our little community had. And nothing's changed in 30 years. In my view, we're less energy secure, and our economy could be in for a real roller coaster. And 30 years of the market, it delivered the technologies that Ernie's talking about, but it didn't propel them into wide use. And so I really do think that just to comfort oneself and say no politician in the United States needs to stand up and provide any leadership, it'll all happen on its own, is highly wishful thinking. I mean, we have preferences. We prefer to have it be a cleaner, not a dirtier fuel, right? We have inefficiencies and market failures where investment capital can't get to OPEC countries to develop oil and gas resources because we have political barriers. We have environmental barriers in the United States that prevent the price signal from attracting new facilities and infrastructure. So we're not in a perfect market. We're in a market where there's an operating political cartel, countries of whom are members who have vowed hostile foreign policies towards the United States. And to say that somehow the market is going to solve that, because magically, it's true, General Electric is talking about investing $2 billion a year in new clean energy technologies, and so the fact that, ExxonMobil or some other firm doesn't feel the need to do it, well, GE is going to be out there doing it, that's true, but what is the scale of the challenge? And the scale of the challenge that Dr. Moniz just mentioned it's going to take a lot more than 10 entrepreneurs in Marin County to come up with nanofibers to put up on a roof so that your house can capture the sun. I mean, it's going to take a massive national effort, and we shouldn't fool ourselves. And also, what have we seen in the past? What we've seen in the past, many times, more than once, is we're going to have economic damage created by high oil prices. That is going to cause a recession, possibly just in the United States, but probably more global in nature. Oil demand will then go down as a result of the fact that economic growth will go down. And then the oil price will go down, and we won't need any of these quote-unquote market signals for technology. And then we'll be back 10 years later into the same place. So that's what's happened since 1973. And we really need to move away from thinking that somehow it's going to magically solve itself. It's going to take proper policy to create the framework to propel innovation at the level and scale that it is to address the kind of severe problems that we're facing.
Again, just one footnote to that. Again, I certainly agree with Amy, and the issue is not to go against fundamental market principles, but it's how you condition the market to respect public goods like security, like environment, et cetera. And again, as a reminder, with the CAFE standards, that was perhaps one of the few times that we, in some sense, internalized security costs by emphasizing efficiency. And in fact, for 10 years, over a 10-year period, we basically tripled the automobile fuel economy, and then we stopped. And now we have 500 horsepower engines instead of perfectly adequate engines.
John Elkind in the back.
I wonder if the panelists could comment on the politics of energy. It's obviously a topic that we've just touched on kind of in a glancing blow. It is obviously the driver that is going to either succeed or fail to get some of these ideas into reality in our marketplace. It seems to me that to date the policy process has not been very effective at internalizing some of the even medium-term, to say nothing of longer-term, challenges that stand before us. And I'd be interested in your comments as to how that can be changed, if it can be changed.
I'm an academic. I don't do politics.
Let me take a shot at that one. I mean, as Ernie said earlier, the politics, particularly in transportation, has been not so much Republican, Democratic, but it's been Detroit and labor and the transition costs of a more fuel-efficient system, and so those votes against CAFE standards tends to be defeated by wider margins, year after year. But when Pete Domenici turns around and says, well, I think maybe we've got to look at fuel efficiency standards in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, maybe you see the ice breaking a little bit. But, I mean, I think you still have to solve the problem of how do you create a transition for more fuel-efficient cars that doesn't bankrupt Detroit, that allows them time for transition, that doesn't basically completely decimate U.S. manufacturing, and accounts for both regional differences, heavier cars versus lighter cars. And that requires a kind of conversation and strategic planning with industry that we have been loath to engage in. That smacks of industrial policy, industrial planning, but that's exactly what we need to do. But you're talking about a tremendous leadership effort there to bring in labor and automobiles and Republicans and Democrats and try and come up with something that's likely to be a very long-term system, and maybe isn't CAFE, but is something that's a little bit more nuanced and sophisticated, that's tailored for U.S. industry. I just don't see the appetite for that right now, and the nature of our politics is that consumers are disaggregated, and some of our industries are greatly aggregated, and they're more influential in Washington, more effective lobbies. The groundswell calling for CAFE standards just doesn't exist in a way that translates into our political process. Catastrophes help.
I would just add to that, David. I think you say the appetite doesn't exist, and it won't exist until there's a lot more push from industry to want a coherent policy. We talk about Detroit and transitions, et cetera. Well, the fact is the current pathway may not look like the most robust one to future market share. Certainly, if you look in terms of automotive technologies, I mean, you can pick a number. 10 years behind the Japanese in hybrids, 10 years behind the Europeans in advanced diesel. So we can hang on to that little market share for a little while longer, although I don't understand how buying cars at our employees' price plus a $5,000 discount is holding those margins, but eventually run into a cliff. We ran into the cliff in 1973. I mean, that's where the first huge Japanese market share took part. So this is also not a sensible, sustained political strategy, really. But let's face it, you know as well as we that until industry, I think, has a bit more coherence in wanting to pursue these, Washington will never do it.
That's great. One more gentleman here on the side. You can identify yourself, please. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Joe Goffman. I work for Senator Lieberman, and I have a question for Professor Jaffe. A couple of times, both in your initial presentation and in one of your answers, you alluded to the fact that some OPEC members, motivated by political or foreign policy reasons, would engage in very hostile supply or pricing practices. One of the things that I think my boss has observed in trying to quietly discuss this set of issues with his colleagues is that there exists a kind of market-driven complacency, one that presupposes that most of the key members of OPEC will ultimately act in an economically rational way that will trump some of the concerns or hypothetical behaviors that Professor Jaffe articulated. And I'm really curious to hear what your comeback to that is. And then my second question is for Professor Moniz. You tantalizingly suggested that we might think about some alternatives to CAFE, and if you would care to elaborate, I'd love to hear it.
All right, I guess I'll go first. There is this thing that's said, that's very frequently said, oftentimes in the context of Saudi Arabia, that even if Osama bin Laden were to take over Saudi Arabia, he would have to produce the oil because they would have to sell it to have money. But we do know from the history of the Iranian Revolution that the initial Iranian government that came in that sweep did change the policy of the country for a period of time to try to diversify away from being dependent on oil as a commodity. There were people in the Ayatollah's original circle that felt that oil was a curse, which is now a little bit more jingoistic and widely discussed, and that we cannot just count on the largesse of nations to say, we're going to consider your interests as more important than our own foreign policy or strategic thinking or our security or our people. And so the example that most springs to my mind is an example where the country of Iran feels highly threatened by United States and European policy towards its aspirations for nuclear weapons. And you know, when you sit as an American and think about that topic, everybody thinks the Iranians are disingenuous, that they don't really need nuclear weapons for security reasons, the fact that other nations on their border are nuclear powers is not a real threat to them because we've analyzed it's not a real threat to them, and so therefore they would never really truly need the nuclear weapons, and all we have to do is come up with the right EU carrot and the right American stick, and they're going to just forget about whatever they think are their strategic interests. Well, you know, in a world where that whole process goes badly, in a world where taking 1 million barrels a day off the market today would double the price, the Iranians have a tremendous amount of leverage they can use if they feel cornered. And the same thing goes if those of you in the audience who followed the public press statements by Hugo Chavez about the United States wanting to assassinate him, whether you believe that he believes that, or whether we would ever, obviously, probably not seriously consider doing that. But again, in a world where the president of Venezuela feels highly threatened and he wanted to assert himself in a manner that his own personal or the national security was at stake, one could imagine him using his oil to assert his claim that he needs to be protected or his country needs to be protected. And I can come up with other instances. So this presumption that somehow no country in the world that produces oil would ever have the nerve to do what they did in 1973. I mean, in those days, we had to worry about a group of oil-producing countries getting together. In today's market, being the way it is, with any kind of disruption causing such a huge result. I mean, just Hurricane Katrina, look at where it moved the price and what that meant for Americans at the pump, right? So you could imagine that any individual country today, any individual country that didn't like the foreign policy of the United States, that wanted to isolate us from our allies in Japan or Europe or other places where they're highly exposed to changes in the price of oil, any one country today that's a large but not giant exporter can have an impact on us. And that's a pretty bad situation to be in if you're trying to be a global power, defending a global system, making markets work, and hoping that markets will clear.
Thanks, Amy. Ernie?
Actually, on the Iran nuclear, let me just add one footnote since that was raised. I do note that independent of anyone's analysis of whether or not Iran needs nuclear weapons, Iran is a signatory to the NPT, and so they have declared, if you like, that they don't need nuclear weapons. And the only issue we need to discuss in that context is providing security of supply. A longer story. It's very difficult to deal with the problem without engaging them, but that's a separate issue. On the question of the CAFE standards, I would just observe, well, of course, there is one alternative that I'm sure your boss, like at least 99 other people in his club, don't want to discuss. It's called gasoline taxes of substance. Would be, for example, another way of addressing efficiency in a perfectly good market context. But there are other issues as well, fee baits and other kinds of mechanisms that can be discussed and that have pluses and minuses with regard to the CAFE standards.
Let me just jump in on the CAFE standard question. We had a task force which Ernie and David and everybody else served on, and there's no reason why we couldn't put a luxury tax on vehicles purchased in the United States on the basis of their efficiency. So if somebody feels the need to drive a car that gets 3 miles to the gallon, that can be their right. Yeah. But if you want to buy a yacht in this country or smoke cigarettes, we tax you. And there's no reason why we couldn't tax those Americans who choose to use a very inefficient vehicle. That would stimulate people to consider that tax in what car they selected in the marketplace. And that's another very unonerous tax for the most middle-class Americans, because they can just choose to buy a smaller car or a car that gets better mileage, and we could just X out those cars that Ernie made allusion to, where Detroit makes $4,000 margin on the car because that's better than when they're selling a sedan and they only make $200 on the car.
That's right. We've got time for, I think, 2 more questions. Gentlemen in the front row, you've been very patient. Can I wait for the microphone and identify yourself?
Sir, I have heard that there is a
Can you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, Mani Philip. I have heard that there is a peak in all the Western countries you was talking about. There is Norway or Scotland, all those places. Now, if that is true, can you tell me where they are now at this time? The second one is, in the New York Times today I read that if the sanctions are given to Iran, where Ms. Jaffe was speaking about, then the price of oil would go up. How can that be possible when we are not having any dealings with them? That's all.
Let me address both things. And David, I forgot to take up your excellent suggestion to talk about Canadian tar sand. As Ernie talked about in terms of recovery technology and other technologies, I tend to get nervous when people say, geez, the oil production of the UK North Sea is starting to decline, and therefore the end of the world has begun. And there are, as Dr. Moniz pointed out, a tremendous amount of reserves left in the world, both conventional and unconventional, that can be tapped, especially if people believe the price of oil was going to stay above $30. I mean, the ongoing cost of developing Canadian tar sands today is around $10 a barrel. And so it doesn't take a $60 market to see those investments come online. And there are challenges in terms of the amount of energy it takes to produce tar sands and whether or not we have enough natural gas or other things. But again, there are people who are looking at, innovating for where the source of the energy would come to produce the tar sands. So I really don't think, of course it's a challenge that the so-called easy oil that we produce here in the United States or that was produced in the UK has hit a sort of a peak, but some of that is technology-driven. Here in the United States, it's actually political. I mean, there's huge amounts of natural gas off the shore of Florida, North Carolina, Maine. We have oil resources in some of those locations as well, and we just simply say that even though Hurricane Ivan knocked down, 26 platforms in the Texas Gulf of Mexico, and as a Texan, I can assure everybody in the audience that South Padre Island's beaches were as beautiful as Cape Cod this year as in any past year, that people continue to whine about their coastline when, for deep water drilling 7,000 miles offshore, the beaches are not at risk. And in the end, in terms of the second part of your question about Iran, Iran is now exports range between, they're probably roughly about 2 or 2.5 million barrels a day, maybe 3 million barrels a day, depending on Iranian internal demand. 3 million barrels a day. And if the United States and its European allies decided that the only way to manage the so-called political controversy over Iran and its nuclear weapons policy, taking those exports out of the market in today's market would, as written in the New York Times, add to the woes we already have in the market and drive prices higher. I don't think there's any question that if the market believed there was going to be an embargo against Iran from exporting its oil, that prices would go up dramatically and they would go up immediately.
Great. Thanks, Amy. I think we've come to the end of panel one. We've got another panel this afternoon. John Kalitsky will chair. Charles McPherson from the World Bank is here. I want to welcome Robin West in the back and Julian Ane, his colleague. We have seats up here in the front for you as well. So we'll take a 10-minute break and then return here for panel two. Thank you all, and thank you, Amy, for participating by phone.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
in.
That was very well timed.
Well, yeah.
I just want to say,
Robin, you're here.
in case the race next, I'm going to rush out at about 5 because of the plane.
Got it. Got it. That's fine. Glad it worked well with your plane schedule.
Yeah.
I find that once one starts to speak, people come in, so I'm going to use that time-honored device. And I want to thank David and his panel for getting us off to a wonderful start, focused as they were on driving forces in energy security, looking in particular at China and OPEC technology and petroleum reserve policy. In this second panel discussion, we will consider flashpoints and responses in the world of energy security and foreign policy. Joining us is the founder and chairman of PFC Energy, Robin West, who will speak about Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, and World Bank senior advisor Charles McPherson, whose tantalizing topic is defeating the oil curse. After Robin and Charles speak, I can add a few comments on Russia and Eurasia, and I'm delighted that, in fact, that the co-author of a chapter that I did for the book, John Elkind, is here, so he'll keep me honest and add to what I have to say, I'm sure. And I'm also delighted to see Julian Nene here, who contributed an excellent chapter on Russia and the Caspian. Very few are neutral about Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, particularly Iraq for the purposes of this discussion. Some believe we should reduce Saudi power as effectively the energy hegemons and arbiters. Others believe we should cooperate more effectively with the Saudis, perhaps as part of a new compact between producers and consumers. On Iraq, some have seen its huge oil reserves as a potential third way in the long term. Others have a much more restrained view of Iraq's role, reinforced by the continued conflict in that country. Helping us to sort through all this is Robin West. It's great to have you here, Robin. I'll just turn the mic over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Jan. I enjoyed listening to the first session. I was honored to be asked by Messrs. Kalicki and Goldwyn to participate in this prodigious undertaking. It began a long time ago, and getting all these authors, many of whom find humility an unbecoming virtue, to get them all to get things in and on time is no mean feat. I would actually take issue with David and Jan in that I would change the title. This is called Energy and Security. I think that given current times it should be called Energy Insecurity because that's really the age we've entered. We define energy security as reliable supply at reasonable cost. And the fact of the matter is we have entered a time where I think that supplies are increasingly unreliable and costs will be increasingly unreasonable. So we are entering uncharted waters. My assignment is to talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia and Iraq. In terms of Saudi Arabia, I feel very strongly that irrespective of what one may think about the Saudi Arabian political system and Saudi values, some of which I'm frankly not comfortable with, I think Saudi Arabia has been a very constructive partner in the international energy business. I was the one who coined the phrase that Saudi Arabia is the central banker of the oil market, providing liquidity and stability to the market. And I think that they have done a very, very responsible job, and they see it as in their national interest to be the arbiter of the market. Will they continue to be the arbiter of the market? I believe so. Saudi Arabia, point out, not only has massive production, but it is the only country that has very much swing production, and it's the only country likely to have any swing production, excess production capacity. It costs billions and billions of dollars to have this kind of capacity, and no one else is going to develop it. I think that in terms of, we talk a little bit about in the chapter about the political system in Saudi Arabia. There was a view at one point that the Saudi royal family and the structure would come crashing over. Wyche Fowler is in the audience, so I should be very careful what I say. He probably knows much more than I do on the subject. But I think that it's important to look at the Saudi royal family. As one member of the royal family said to me, Robin, this is in Riyadh, he said, this is the only city I know where there are more princes than there are taxi drivers. The Saudi royal family, it's important to understand, is a tribe. It's not a situation as with Iran in 1979. It's not just a few people. It's a lot of people, and they have to reach consensus. And they represent views from all end of the spectrum, from Stanford and Princeton educated, international, cosmopolitan, highly educated, highly numerative, very well read individuals to people who are basically a suspicious conservative people from the desert who are still reflect the old traditions of Saudi Arabia. And if you've ever been to Saudi Arabia and you go and see some of the villages and things the way Saudi Arabia was even 75 years ago, it is simply staggering how far they've come. They have lots of problems, I'm not saying that. But I think that this is a country that has more tensile strength than people understand. So from our standpoint, we do not believe that, although these are very risky times, that energy insecurity is rife. We really don't believe that the stability of the Saudi royal family is, at this point, in the near term, the near to medium term, it has lots of challenges. It hasn't handled all of its challenges very well since September 11th, but it is nevertheless, it functions and it has moved to meet some of the challenges. I don't agree with all the responses. We go through some of these things. But at any rate, I think that don't count the Saudi royal family out. I think it's pretty stable. The second thing is that there is a view of my business, although I'm based in Washington, my clients tend to be international oil companies, not governments. And the view of most of the international oil companies is that Saudi Aramco is extremely well run and highly professional. These are, it is a national oil company, but they've made massive investment. The Aramco partners, although there are only two of them left, it used to be Texaco, Mobil, Exxon, and Chevron. Now it's just Chevron and Exxon, but they have this tremendous technology exchanges, training. So we believe the sector is well run and well managed. So you have a relatively politically stable situation and you have a capably managed petroleum sector. That's kind of the short term in terms of a risk to the market. As I say, I think there are a lot of problems in the world. I don't think Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest problems. I think Iran, which was discussed at the previous session, or Venezuela, or some other places are much more fragile and unstable. There's a second issue which and I also believe that the notion of replacing Saudi Arabia in its role as the central bank will be extraordinary. It just won't. It can't happen. No one else will do it. They don't have the reserve base. They don't have the capital. It just isn't going to happen. That being said, our sense is that right now, OPEC in general and Saudi Arabia in particular, they are not influencing the market very much. They are they're kind of along for the ride. I mean, the market has gotten away from them. And so I think Saudi Arabia will try and be a cushion, as they did during Hurricane Katrina. They said they would surge production. And I think, anyway, they're trying to be constructive, but I think there's, given how tight the markets are right now, it's quite difficult for them to do that. There's a second issue. I'm off to Houston tomorrow morning to debate Matt Simmons in front of the World Affairs Council in Houston. And one of the issues, Matt says Saudi Arabia's basically that their production has peaked and that it's the beginning of the twilight of the oil industry. We don't quite agree with Matt on Saudi Arabia, although directionally I don't think he's incorrect. We believe that Saudi Arabia, their current production is about 10 million, 9 and 10 million barrels a day. They want to take it up to 12 million. We believe their reserve base will support that, and that they can maintain 12 million barrels a day sustained production capacity. The problem is that the international petroleum system generates now about 83 to 84 million barrels a day, and we see basically by 2010 that the non-OPEC production, including tar sands and everything else, will be more or less peaking, and then the call will be on OPEC. Depending on demand and what you think is going to happen with Chinese demand and Indian demand and U.S. demand, there's a point at which demand will exceed supply. Well, that can't go on for very long. And we believe that there's a chance for serious economic disruption at that point. We believe markets work. We also believe markets are pitiless, and that markets will work in that condition. We can go into, if you want, national oil companies and things like the structure of some of that. There was a discussion of NOCs. We've done a lot of work on NOCs. But I think that our view is that Saudi Arabia can get you up to 12 million and maybe have a surge capability of another 2 million barrels, 2.5 million barrels. But that's all you can expect, and that's all the Saudis have said. There was an article, that's all they said they would do. There was an article in the New York Times, Sunday Magazine section a couple weeks ago on peak oil, and it kind of it was a jumble because Mr. Moss, who I think was trying to do the right thing, but he didn't, there's a number of separate issues. The Saudis have never said that they were going to fill the huge supply requirements going forward. They have never said that. And they can't, and they won't. And the question is, they will meet their requirements, I think, up to something on the order of 12.5 million barrels. But beyond that, I think it's up to the rest of the world. Now, there is one caveat in all of this, and that's how do they get up to 12 million barrels. They may have the resources and they may have the capital to be able to invest, but there's a fundamental problem, and that is the service sector has simply been reduced to just a shadow of its former self. And the Saudis are now out tendering for drilling rigs, cranes, all kinds of services. Money not being an object, they just can't get a lot of this stuff. And this is a constraint that's happening all over the world. And everyone assumes that the market will respond, and markets do respond, but it's going to take longer. And the infrastructure in certain places really isn't there. So that's Saudi Arabia, and I'll be happy to duke it out with whomever, because I'm sure some people don't agree. Let me turn to Iraq, and what I would like to do is not go into sort of what's going on the ground right there, right now, other than to say Iraqi production under Saddam was about 2.5 million barrels a day. It's now about 1.85. They're exporting about 1.2 million barrels. Things are kind of sliding downhill in Iraq. Not only is their production sliding, but the quality of the crude is sliding. They basically, it's higher sulfur crude. They are they're not managing the fields very well. Part of it is physical safety, but the other problem is that the petroleum sector. It's important to remember there have been 3 governments since the invasion, and soon there will be a 4th. So there's been enormous turnover in Iraq, and that the second thing is that and with all this turnover, there's been a lot of politicization of the sector, and they're trying to push people in. There were some very, very capable people in the Iraqi ministry in the old days. But it's now it's becoming increasingly politicized and, frankly, increasingly corrupt. And some of the corruption is just people trying to get, a couple of cans of Spam or whatever it is they eat out there to be able to just feed their families. But there's also corruption at higher levels. This is in SOMO, in the State Oil Marketing Organization. There's corruption, and there's also going to be massive corruption in the area of licensing. And this is going to be a huge free-for-all when the companies can come in. The problem now is that the place is A, so unstable, but B, there's so much corruption that one of the things that Iraq desperately needs at a certain point to get their production back up, and they have a huge reserve base. They could get up to 5 or 6 million barrels a day if it was properly managed, I think fairly easily. I mean, it would take time and massive investment, but with proper investment it could happen. But there is a requirement for international investment. And the system now is so corrupt that it would be very, very difficult for large Western companies to do business there now. Simply the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act would bar it. And so I think that the only companies that would play ball under the new rules that are there, people like the Russians and the Chinese, they will clearly, they do not have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I assure you. So this is really a very, very serious problem. And the last point I'd like to make is that there's been regionalization in decision-making. If you follow the debate on the Constitution, there's been a fight over whether the central government's going to hold it or hold the authority or the regions, because the oil is basically in the Kurdish north and the Shia south. It gets confusing because existing production, the management policy is going to be shared between the central and these regional authorities. But future production is extremely ambiguous, and in terms of management, in terms of revenues, and there's enormous potential for instability and corruption, and just the ability to get a decision. And one of the things about the oil business, if you are going to move production from under 2 million to over 5 or 6 million, you're going to need tens and tens of billions of dollars, and you have to have a stable environment for a long period of time. And that simply doesn't exist right now. So, on those notes.
Thank you very much, Robin. We'll look forward very much to getting back to those great points. Let's turn now to Charles McPherson. With the notable exception of Norway and other North Atlantic producers, many believe that oil wealth equals an oil curse of corruption, mismanagement, repression, and continued misery for most people in oil-producing countries. And Charles brings unequaled experience struggling with these issues at the World Bank and will tell us whether we have a hope of defeating the oil curse. Charles?
Thank you very much, Jan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. I also want to thank Jan and David for allowing me the opportunity to participate in this book, which I think is really quite a remarkable achievement. It's a pleasure to be here. As Jan said, I've been asked to address the topic of defeating the oil curse. I'm going to keep my remarks in the 5 to 7 limit that's been imposed, because I know a lot of people in this room are quite familiar with this topic, and a lot of you have a great deal to add to the debate and discussion on it. In brief, I'm going to describe what the phenomenon is, the oil curse, why we should be concerned. I'll identify what I think are 3 or 4 of the key contributing factors. And while I'm not going to come up with any magic bullets, I will suggest there are some signs of progress in this area, not necessarily in the 2 countries Robin has just been discussing with you. What's meant by the oil curse, or as I prefer to call it, the paradox of plenty, which was the term coined by the Stanford professor Terry Lynn Carl. I like that term better because the oil curse suggests a certain inevitability, and there should be no reason why inevitably oil has to bring curses. Paradox suggests that maybe you have a chance of turning the situation around. The paradox refers to the fact that Jan just mentioned, that an overwhelming majority of the oil resource-rich countries, particularly in the developing world and in economies in transition, have been underperforming. They've been underperforming relative to the people who don't have oil resources or don't have extractive industry resources. They've been underperforming against a wide variety of criteria. Almost every measure of economic performance, almost all human development indicators, and they've had more than their fair share of social and political unrest. lower per capita growth rates than other countries, on the scores that they have on human development indicators are often abysmal, very low per capita income, infant mortality is high, no access to proper drinking water, female literacy is at the bottom of the pack. All these indicators are discouraging. And as I said, they have more than their fair share of social and political and unrest, and which is important to the topic today and to this book, and often very violent conflict, which doesn't promote any stability. Something has clearly gone wrong in the connection between oil resources and development. Why should we be concerned about this? Well, I think the results I've just outlined and that many of us are familiar with give cause for concern on many levels. For the purposes of the discussion today and for this book that has just been finished, the concern derives from the fact that derives from its relevance for energy security. Over 90% of the world's oil reserves are located in developing countries or in economies in transition. You can correct me on the numbers, Robin, but I think we're pretty close. In fact, I may have even gotten them from you. I'm not sure. The same countries account to 85 to 90% of the world's exports of oil, and similar numbers apply in the case of, in the increasingly important case of natural gas and natural gas trade. Dependable access to these oil and gas supplies is critical to energy and indeed the economic well-being and security of the major energy importing countries, the U.S. being foremost among them. But dependable access in turn is inextricably linked to the stability of these exporting countries, and in particular to their ability to put themselves on a path of sustainable development. Unfortunately, these two goals have proved very elusive, and most of the countries that we're interested in show all the signs of suffering from severe oil curse or paradox of plenty. The sought-after stability and sustainable development simply hasn't materialized, and global and U.S. energy security has been correspondingly compromised. What are the contributing factors to the paradox of plenty? I would single out, there are lots, and the list can be quite long. In fact, came up with a rather long list in the chapter, but I think there are four main categories. Two of them are technical. One is the Dutch disease. I'm not going to go into details on that, but basically a rapid appreciation of the exchange rate and an escalation in the price of domestic factors of production as a result of the large inflow of cash from exports of oil or whatever the natural resource is, drives up the price of local origin exported goods, erodes their competitiveness, and it does lead to lots of social stress because of its impact on employment and simply the distribution of wealth in the country. The second technical factor is one that we're all very familiar with, especially today, and that's the notorious volatility in oil revenues, largely as a result of price, but also as a consequence of other factors like new discoveries and so on, but very, very volatile revenues. Both of these technical considerations really kind of go with the turf if you're a major a country with major oil resources. But that doesn't mean that they aren't difficult. In fact, they're extremely difficult to manage in practice. The other two factors I'd like to mention are political and institutional. The first of these is capacity in the producing country. The paradox of plenty countries that we are concerned with are famously short on institutional capacity, whether it relates to economic planning, macroeconomic management, these kinds of things. These are crippling weaknesses when you're faced with the kind of technical challenges that I just referred to. Very, very hard to take on these problems if you haven't built up the institutional capacity. The second political factor is governance. I've saved this one for the last in the list of four factors simply because in a way it's the decisive factor underlying all the others. Bad policies, economic mismanagement, limits on public participation and debate, limits on democracy, frankly. All these things, and actually corruption, maybe I should really underscore, are contributing in a major way to the paradox of plenty. Weak governance, unfortunately, can be linked in good part to the oil wealth itself. Oil wealth simply undermines accountability. It undermines incentives to reform, and it acts as a lightning rod for corruption. We're seeing it in Iraq, as Robin said, in a big way, which is really too bad. How do we address this paradox? The oil curse, or paradox of plenty, as I said I prefer, is now a well-known phenomenon. It's widely recognized, but unfortunately identifying practical solutions is proved very difficult. Successfully addressing the paradox will depend fundamentally on better petroleum revenue management, which covers a range of initiatives from petroleum-specific measures, sector-specific measures, to macroeconomic policies, the whole context of the oil sector, and to improve policies for poverty alleviation. You have to be showing you're doing something with the oil money if you're going to have a happy and stable population. The technical nature of the difficulties that I've identified notwithstanding, achieving a better petroleum revenue management in practice is not fundamentally a technical problem. Rather, I think it's a problem or an issue of political will, and this is something that my editors both underscored when we were going through the chapter, and I agree with them. Exercising that political will is primarily the responsibility of the government of the petroleum-producing country. But that said, the responsibility has to be shared among all stakeholders in the problem. Industry, civil society, the international financial institutions and organizations like my own, donor government, and governments of the oil and gas importing countries like the United States, perhaps most importantly. That shared responsibility can take a vast variety of forms, including, but not limited to, financial and technical support to these countries, contributions to capacity building in the countries, much better public information campaigns, and political and economic leverage exerted by those who can do it. Let me close now by saying that, well, this is a hugely difficult challenge, and it's not going to go away for some time, I think. There are some signs of progress. Some of the positive signs I'll list below, and I'd be happy to discuss these in more detail during the plenary period. First of all, a number of the oil-rich countries appear to have, and this grasped the nettle, to take a phrase out of recent conflict resolution literature, including Robin's Institute, my wife's own co-authored book. So hats off. But they have really taken the dive and started to do something about the problem. What are the countries? Well, some we could discuss. Nigeria, Azerbaijan, a very small country which has been exemplary in this area. East Timor, the newest country in the world and one of the poorest, is handling its newfound petroleum wealth in an extraordinarily positive way. Many of these are not just focusing on the petroleum sector. These countries are not just focusing on the petroleum sector, but also doing what it takes to address the broader context of economic and social reform, which is critical. You can't just deal with one piece of the economy. The international oil industry, at least that part of it which is located in OECD countries, and that's go back to Robin's reference to the countries that are outside that category, for example, from the BRIC countries, from particularly Russia, India, China, and so on. But the ones located in OECD countries have really assigned a high priority to working in a collaborative way on this problem. Partly out of concern for reputational risk, and partly because it just makes good business sense. If you have a stable business partner in a country, your business is going to do much better. Civil society, well, some of the companies, by the way, that are leaders in this area include BP, Shell, Chevron, Texaco, really taking very positive, proactive positions. Civil society, absolutely fundamental importance, both at the international and local levels. That civil society has been extremely active in its pursuit of better governance in resource-rich countries. A number of groups that I could mention, at least at the international level, maybe the local ones wouldn't be as well known to you, but international level, there's the Publish What You Pay campaign, there's the work and publications of Catholic Relief Services based here in the Washington area, Save the Children, Oxfam, Human Rights Watch, and so on. All have made major contributions in raising global and local awareness of the issues and pressing hard on all players for concrete actions. The international financial institutions are assigning a major importance to resource revenue management now in their country programs, in the technical assistance they provide, and in their lending programs. For example, at my institution, at the World Bank, you cannot take an item to the board now if you're talking about a country which is rich in oil without addressing the resource curse problem. That has to be paragraph 1 or part 1 of your presentation, and showing that something is happening in that area, something positive. The international organizations also include joint and bilateral groupings of institutions. On the multilateral side, I would mention the initiatives that are being taken by the G8, and this is now going through 3 G8 sessions. Evian in France, Sea Island here in the United States, and most recently Gleneagles have all put this high on their agenda. In fact, it seems to be moving up the agenda. There are other initiatives, the Millennium Challenge Account, here in the United States, the governance compacts that have been put together at the level of the OECD. There's the anti-corruption campaign, and the UN. At the UN, there's the Global Compact. Lots of examples of people getting with the program and pursuing better governance in these countries. I'll stop there, Jan, and be happy
Thank
to
you,
discuss
Charles,
further.
very, very much. I'll deliberately say only a few words on Russia and Eurasia in order to give ample time for questions and answers, but I'm going to put Julia and John on notice that I would be delighted if they'd add to this when we do get to questions and answers. Turning to Russia and Eurasia, our book offers chapters by Julia on the prospects for renaissance in oil and gas, and John and myself on Eurasian transportation futures, as well as one by former EU Energy Commissioner Loyola de Palacio on reforming the European gas market, which is fueled primarily by supplies to the East. And I guess it is timely also for us to be talking about this subject because later this week President Putin will be here in New York and then down to Washington, where he'll be meeting with President Bush, and I'm sure energy policy is likely to be on the agenda. The great hope, of course, is that as the largest non-OPEC energy supplier, Russia will enhance the energy security of Europe and the U.S. But there are a number of challenges that are faced if Russia is to play this role. It'll have to overcome a leveling of its production from underinvestment, statism, and reduced opportunities for private investors. However, one big opportunity ahead is the Stockman field, a giant gas field, which could be transformed into LNG and delivered to the North American market. Another significant opportunity to bring additional volumes of oil and gas comes from the Caspian producers, notably Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, to market. Giant fields like Shah Deniz and Kashagan can make a significant difference, but like Russian production, they must be transported effectively to the international marketplace, and that means overcoming a number of challenges that John Elkind and I address in our chapter, notably the monopolist challenge still coming from the Russian state pipeline companies. And there are ways to do this, including expanding the CPC pipeline in Russia and completing BTC and other oil and gas pipelines from Azerbaijan to Turkey and from Kazakhstan both westward and eastward. Some believe correctly, I think, that President Putin's recent decision to make a new oil pipeline to China a top priority is not unrelated to the Chinese-Kazakh agreement to create an oil pipeline between their two countries. So that gives you a sense, if you will, of another part of the world that's addressed in our volume. And as I mentioned at the outset, we try to address, both from a general geopolitical and economic standpoint and in terms of the specific challenges, each of the key energy provinces in the world. And let me now just move us. We have a lot of material here presented by the panelists into the questions and answers, and invite Julia and John, if you'd like to say a couple of words. I'd be delighted to get this rolling, and then we can get back to the comments on Robin and Charles' side of things. Julia, John, would you like to? Julia, okay.
Well, I think you've mostly said it all. The one other development that I think is interesting, if you look at the details, is the fact that China concluded a potential deal to buy a large producer in Kazakhstan, and that there is a pipeline that will start up from China to Kazakhstan at the end of this year. And just today I saw that the Chinese company CMPC has also reached some sort of agreement potentially with Russia to help them in building a pipeline from Russia to China as well. So the Chinese are moving forward in an area that is adjacent to them and capturing resources. But clearly the story of Russia with Russian production, which many people anticipated would head up to 10, 11, 12 million barrels a day, is one where there's a great deal of uncertainty now. And the production could well level off between 9 and 10 million barrels a day and not reach the levels that we expected even a year ago it might reach. So that's about all.
Thank you, Julia. That's great. And John?
Thank you, Jan. Just a couple of comments that I would make. And the first, in relation to the Russia and the other post-Soviet countries, goes just as easily for any of the other oil-producing countries around the world, in which it's very hard to have a conversation about good energy policy on the producer side when oil is hovering around $70 a barrel. So, some of the difficulties that pertain here shouldn't be at all surprising to us, and I think, in terms of my own views, should be a huge warning sign to the United States about the need to do some of the efficiency improvements that were under discussion on the first panel. A second general comment that I would make in relation to, particularly to Russia and its neighbors in the post-Soviet world, is the difficulty of getting across that very fundamental thing that we're accustomed to look for in the West, which is win-win opportunities, where both Russia has the opportunity, I'll focus on Russia for a moment, where Russia has the opportunity to benefit while at the same time its partners do. And that's been, I think, a chronically difficult point to get to. And then with those two thoughts as background, my final comment, which is that in this time, I think it has been particularly difficult for the current U.S. administration and other parties to get projects going in Russia that would help to address and alleviate some of the supply-side energy security challenges that have been in front of us over the last 5 years. Instead, what we see is conversations taking place between the U.S. government and the Russian government about LNG projects, which are good. That's fine, but Stockman is easily a decade, if not more, away from having a serious impact on the U.S. marketplace. So those are just a few comments to throw into the mix, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to questions, not only on this latest topic, but more also to the other panelists on Saudi Arabia and Iraq, as well as on the issue of the oil curse. So I see a question right here. Yes? And please identify yourselves, if you will.
Chris Schaefer, CNO Resources. Mr. West, thanks for the overview on Iraq, which is sort of very hard to figure out. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about a difference in the North and the South in terms of what investment is needed, and if there's a difference in the sort of corruption in those areas. That is, if you were going to do a project in the Kurdish North, is that easier? Is it different than doing it in the South? And how you see that unfolding vis-a-vis the central government?
Well, basically, the Kurdish North is oil production there is very old. I mean, it goes back to the teens. I think the initial production was there, that the Kurds have been trying to spin out of Iraq for years, or to establish their own autonomous state or region. I think that the Kurdish operation is more organized, more focused, and has had more structure for much longer, but there's actually much less oil there. The Shias in the south, it's not well structured. There is a Southern Oil Company. It was a national oil company. But I think either way, whether you are trying to do deals in the north or south, I would counsel great caution to anyone trying to kind of splinter the. In the end, you got to go to Baghdad too, and there is no consensus between the two. As I say, the resource base is much bigger in the south, but there's substantial resources in the north. The north is more kind of mature and better organized, but there still is no a real sense on either existing production or future production as to what's the deal, who's in charge. And my strong advice is I would not invest unless you have a very, very fast payout deal.
Very good. Yes, in the back, please. You, sir.
I'm Reed Detchen with the Energy Future Coalition. Mr. West, you said that you were concerned that, in part because of the Corrupt Practices Act, that the Chinese or Russians or other parties might be the winners in Iraq. In an era of globalized oil, does that matter, or do you see the reemergence of a fragmented oil market that's tied more directly and contractually to between producer and supplier?
I believe that oil is the oil market is a global market, and oil is a fungible commodity traded in transparent markets. I don't think that's going to change. I think, frankly, the Chinese particularly they're very eager to try and tie up resources in various places. And the three Chinese national oil companies have been moving with very, very limited success so far. They have a tiny percentage of their requirements tied up. I think that, kind of going to Charles's point, I think that it would be a tragedy for Iraq if the oil sector was completely taken over by Russians, Chinese, and Indians, and that the petroleum sector was deeply corrupt. I think one of the problems in oil-producing countries generally is that if you have a corrupt system and there's a lot of oil and a lot of money, basically the government does not need the consent of the governed. That's the problem. And I think that unless you have a transparent, efficient system, the big losers, there'll be less oil coming to the market. It will not optimize the sector. And secondly, I think political instability will be rife in Iraq. I think it would create a lot of problems for Iraq.
Very good. Yes, over
Charles,
here.
do you want to comment on that?
Oh, Charles, do you want to come in? Yes, please.
Yeah, I might just add a little bit to that, because transparency is on the move now, and it's very hard for, Rob and I were talking about it before the session, but it's very hard for a country to say, well, we don't believe in that. The country we were talking about probably will say that for a while, but there's this movement called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and we've been working very closely with that, and there are about 22 countries now, all oil and gas producers, who are participating in that to some more or less to a greater or less extent. And what that will eventually mean is it basically says you have to publish your revenues and publish your payments, and the government has to publish what's received, so that people out there can start looking at these numbers and asking difficult questions and getting reforms and better governance in the countries involved. If you choose not to go down that path, you first of all have to explain to the international community why you don't think that transparency is needed in your country. A difficult thing to do, but it may not bother some countries, but difficult thing to do. And if transparency does take hold in your country, then for it at all to be effective or credible, it has to apply to all the players in the sector. And that includes the Russia, India, China players. They may do other things in their own countries or elsewhere, but if they are going to be involved in a country that's bought into this international program of revenue transparency, they are going to have to do exactly what ExxonMobil does, Chevron Texaco does, Total and BP do. So there will, right now, we see a lot of these stories where these people are coming in under the radar screen with a very different set of standards. But I hope, and I think maybe that time may be becoming more limited, at least in many countries.
Let me add one other thing. That one kind of blind spot, I think, in a lot of transparency work is about reporting of government accounts, and that money is stolen from the government or mismanaged in the government. There's one area that is where money doesn't go to the government or doesn't have to go to the government, and that would be large bribes paid to government officials in order to get contracts. That money never hits the books. And in Iraq, if the sector opens up, if you're not careful, there will be billions of dollars spent in those bribes. And that money is really hard to track down.
You want to come back to Charles? Let's give Charles 1 minute, and then we'll
Very,
get back to
very,
the
very
audience.
quickly. No, I mean, absolutely.
It's important.
In transparency, you can't simply announce. And I also want you to report how much money was in that black bag you left under the table.
But maybe we can figure out a way.
Very quickly, I think those numbers are going to be very large, but relative to the total volume of money received in most of these countries, they're going to be small, and you really want to get accountability on the total volume of revenues going to the country. What did you do with it? Where did it go? I think that's a very important
That's the
thing
difference
to
between
keep
Charles
in
and
mind.
me. A couple $1 billion is real money to a small businessman like myself. Charles is nothing.
Let's. A member of the audience has been patiently waiting. Let's recognize him. Yes.
Hurst Groves from Columbia University for Charles McPherson. Could you elaborate a little bit more on East Timor and comment on whether you think the joint development with Australia has played a role in its approach to revenue management? And then a second part of the question is, is there an established correlation between good revenue management and supply stability of exports of oil?
That's good questions.
Very good. East Timor, the resource base there, East Timor is the newest country in the world, and it's only about 2 years old, and a very small country, very poor. It did inherit a significant natural gas reserves, which are now being developed jointly with Australia, and more to come, even larger. And by world standards, sizable, but by East Timorese standards in terms of revenue impact, huge. From the very beginning, East Timor had seen what happened to other countries. It understood the resource curse, and it introduced transparency from the very beginning, even before they had set up sophisticated things like petroleum revenue accounts and so on. They were publishing the amount of money that they put into the bank accounts. They were making the bank accounts transparent and so on. I think that was very much an East Timorese initiative, along with others. It wasn't pushed by Australia. In fact, Australia has at times resisted becoming a member of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. So it was very much a homegrown initiative. Will it add to stability of supply? Well, the jury's still out on that, but I think that you can find that there are websites which are phenomenal on what's going on in East Timor. You can find out everything about revenues and also about all the projects. Incidentally, one other point I want to make on this bribery business is there's complete transparency on the licensing process where the bribes occur, and that's another critical component of transparency. They publish all their criteria, they publish all the bids that were made, and in a very clear way. So it's very important there. Will it add to stability? As I said, everybody will know a great deal about the sector, and including the local population and so on. And hopefully, if it stabilizes East Timor, it will also help stabilize the supplies they provide.
Thank you, Charles. Please, you've been waiting patiently as well.
My first question involved last session too, and
could you again identify yourself, please?
Cha Chen, freelance correspondent.
Please.
And Professor Mollis indicated that we have we lack a political will to deal with efficient vehicle, and now the banker McPherson indicate that that in the oil-producing country, lack the political will to manage the revenue to deal with the social problem. So actually, in both worlds, have a political will problem. And my second question is this: recently, I heard that the U.S. import more petroleum from Canada than Saudi Arabia. Is this true?
Okay, first Charles, and then maybe Robin, if you'd like to. And Ernie, of course, you're part of this, but...
I think
you obviously haven't seen members of royal family and ruling. They already have SUVs and very large limousines.
The whole population.
Well, that's no fun. It doesn't work that way.
Well, the political will issue is one that refers not just to the. I wasn't referring simply to the countries that are producing the petroleum, but political will on part of a large number of stakeholders. I mean, that will is there in civil society, to some extent in the international institutions. It could probably be strengthened, I think David and Jan would agree, in a number of the home countries. The importing countries need to show a real seriousness about these kinds of issues, as well as the exporting countries. But it will take it takes a lot of discussion. It takes a lot of openness to get that will generated. It takes a lot of pressure from the stakeholders.
Robin, on Canada versus Saudi Arabia, any comment?
Yeah, I believe you're correct on oil, but certainly on a BOE basis, on barrels of oil equivalent of oil and gas, we get much more energy from Canada because we have these huge pipelines that move both crude oil and natural gas down here. But I think that kind of misses the basic point, and that is that oil is a world it is a world market in oil, and that whether we get more from, it's just more efficient for us to get it from Canada than Saudi Arabia, but. And there are certain countries where, their energy sector is very well organized and their economy is booming and they are big importers. Being an importer-exporter really isn't the key. It's how efficiently you use it, and we don't use it very efficiently.
But this didn't mention because we always think that we have to depend on Saudi Arabia.
Well, the world market, the key thing is the world market depends on Saudi Arabia, and we are part of the world market.
Right. Yes, several hands back there, all the way in the back, the lady in the back. And please, again identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Mishgan. I'm a program assistant here at the Wilson Center for the Comparative Urban Studies project. This question is directed for Mr. Robin West. How do you think the recent debates and trial of the UN Food for Oil program in Iraq has impacted the production of oil and the future of, hopefully, the uncorrupt management of oil in the country?
I don't think it has any impact at all. I think it was grossly mismanaged by the UN and by the members of the Security Council. I think everyone is responsible. But it had very little to do with the actual operations of the sector itself.
Yes, in the middle here. Yes, please. Yes. Right.
Thank you. I appreciate it. My name is Ben Gieman. I'm a reporter with Environment and Energy Daily. This question is for Mr. West. You mentioned that you're going to be debating Matt Simmons tomorrow. You said that on the one hand you disagree with him, and then you paused and said, but he might be sort of directionally correct. Can you sort of elaborate on what the distinction is there? Thanks.
Matt believes that Saudi Arabia's production will has basically peaked already and it's going to start declining, that some of their supergiant fields are mature. We do not agree with that. We believe their reserve position is substantial enough so that they can sustain their production at 10 million, and if they can get the services necessary, they can probably get up to 12.5 million barrels. But our problem, we believe, is that non-OPEC production. Let me back up. There's a very fundamental fact that's important to understand about the international oil business, and that is 77% of the oil resources are held by national oil companies, by governments. And basically, that is a black box. We don't know what's going on there. We really don't know what's going on in Saudi Arabia, but we don't know what's going on in a lot of other OPEC countries. We do have a pretty good idea what's going on in non-OPEC countries, and my folks have gone through data on every single field, non-OPEC field, and we believe non-OPEC production will peak, around 2010. And again, the key thing is, don't say, well, Robin, it's January 1st, 2011, and oil hasn't gone down. It's really directional. But we see the international petroleum system getting up at about 2015, 2020 to something in the range of 95 to 100 million barrels a day. We do not see how the system can generate more than that, but we see demand continuing to rise. And there's discussion of markets. Absolutely, something's got to give, but my view is that there's the danger. It's kind of like the San Andreas Fault, where enormous pressure builds and then nothing happens, and then there's an economic earthquake or cataclysm or tsunami or whatever you want to call it. I believe, and one of the things that's why this cycle is different. The oil business is a cyclical business. And what broke the back of oil prices in the 70s and early 80s was you had, on the one hand, prices were rising, which affected demand. On the other hand, you had the industry went into places like the North Sea, the North Slope of Alaska, areas where they could explore. But what happens now is that because essentially the oil resources are controlled by state governments, they can't get into those provinces. We don't know how much oil is there, and they can't get in there. And that places like the North Sea and the North Slope are essentially mature. We've looked at heavy oil in Canada. We've looked at the tar sands. We've looked at the Orinoco heavy oil belt. We've looked at all these places. And yes, we believe production will grow a couple million barrels there, which is a hell of a lot of oil. And it'll require billions of dollars of investment. But we don't see it. There's a delta that happens that at about 2015, 2020 that is going to be, we believe, serious trouble. And that the situation is really different than it was before. And people say, well, technology will solve the problem, as it always has. Our view is fine. Just be kind enough to share with me what that technology is.
Well, Ernie did.
And I missed that part of your talk. I came in late. But and how quickly that can be brought on. And right now, in terms of production. Now, the technology... My view is that the real challenge, and I've written op-ed pieces and harassed government officials on this, is that it is a question of political will to deal with demand, but that many people in this room have sat around tables with styrofoam coffee cups debating all of this, and frankly, the people in this room don't have the ability to change things very much, and that until there are important stakeholders in the economy. For example, the American Association of Retired People. If the little old ladies are going to be stuck in their houses, which they cannot heat and cannot afford to get in their cars and go anywhere, these people are going to start raising hell. And AARP is a very powerful constituency. Walmart. You go down the list, there are all kinds of companies that are politically very, very powerful, have never been at the table in the energy debate. And they've got to come to the table. And that's the only way, I think, politicians, one of my favorite quotes was Joe Barton, a congressman, the chairman of the House Energy Committee, and he was quoted in the New York Times as saying, was an article on the energy bill, and he was quoted, somebody said, well, aren't you going to deal with demand? And his quote was, and I'm paraphrasing it, but this is, I hope I'm doing justice to him. He said, well, you can tell people not to drive, but I'm not going to because I want to get reelected. And this is really the challenge. And I think that until there's kind of a new set of stakeholders, and I think it's dawning on everybody that there are a hell of a lot of stakeholders, and this is cutting a lot of different ways. And my view is people better move sooner rather than later. And the technologies may be there, but they haven't right now, in terms of oil and gas extraction, which is my specialty, those technologies, I'm sorry, I don't see them. Now, maybe they're there in terms of more efficient automobiles and, a lot of other things you can do. But, and I do think there are a lot of other things you can do. But until that there are incentives to create different behaviors, nothing's going to happen. I'm sorry, that was a very long answer.
Oh, no, that's a very good answer. We have time maybe for one comment from Professor Muniz, and then a couple more questions, and that's about it. Yes.
Just to restate some of the technology issues, Robin, clearly heavy oil and tar sands have potential for more, but I think...
A couple million barrels, but I don't see 50 million barrels.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, I'm neither overly bullish nor overly bearish, but I just want to emphasize that another place that's less often discussed is this question of further extraction from more or less mature oil fields. A lot of oil on the ground, and at these prices, there's a lot that one can do. You get 10% more out of those fields, let's say on average, and that's 300 billion barrels of oil over a long period of time with a lot of investment. But
yes, a question over here.
Mr. West commented on
You didn't recognize
the international problem with access to new drilling opportunities. There's another factor that occurs to me. I read an interview with the chairman of Exxon recently, where he said when they are thinking about an investment, today's price is simply irrelevant. The question is, what's the price of oil going to be 10 years down the road, because that's how long it takes to bring a significant supply of oil on stream, at least. Now, my observation is that increases in exploration drilling CapEx have not kept pace with the oil price increase. What has happened is a huge amount of stock buybacks by private international oil companies and some increase in dividends. Do you think that the private sector component of the international oil business will actually keep up and meet expectations for that part of the supply which they are estimated to bring forth?
Thank you for that question, Secretary Coleman. I think there are a couple of issues. One is this: do they have outlets for their capital? And in a lot of cases, the answer really is no. I mean, are they better off giving it back to the shareholders or drilling? Now, at higher prices, one of the things that with higher prices, you will see their upstream, their exploration production budgets are going up, but also be aware their costs are going up very, very dramatically in exploration and development. And so you may see more money moving. You will certainly see more money moving, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually going to see more oil flow from it. I think that I think there are three things that happened to the oil industry. The first was nationalization. The second was commoditization, where in the old days the international oil companies they were price makers, now they're price takers. The old closed system. And the third is the financialization, and that the oil industry is a long lead time, capital intensive, risky business. And what's happened now is they are being judged by portfolio managers and analysts quarterly. And the analysts don't care about 10 years from now. They couldn't care less. They want to see, what's going to be your September 31st. 30 days has September. No, 30 days. It's on September 30th. To maximize profits now, and this is a problem. And this is an industry which there's criticism of the industry on refining. I mean, I would argue that the oil industry has done the companies have been trying to sustain their exploration programs to the extent they can. They just don't have many outlets for their capital. The other criticism: why don't they expand their refineries? Well, the fact of the matter is that Wall Street would beat their brains out if they expanded their refineries, because it's a lower return sector, and if you give us the money, don't put it in some refinery. They have invested in their refineries. They've upgraded and debottlenecked them. They haven't neglected them, but they haven't invested in more of them. But coming back, I mean, I think you're going to see more activity. The other thing is just a lot more money flowing in, not just from the companies. There's much more money in the industry and around the industry. The high return, so capital's pouring in now.
Thank you. Yes, Ambassador Fowler.
Especially since this has been the topic of the last several questions, I was trying to hold my fire, but I want to let Robin and all of you end where you began on energy insecurity. In David and Jan's book, there's an article by Mr. Bowmare where he says that climate change is the greatest problem of the 21st century. And he also says, one sentence is, it is primarily an energy problem. There were 3 commissions that reported this year, 2 appointed by President Bush and 1 by the Congress, all of whom almost unanimously said that climate change is real. It's caused primarily by the burning of fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera. Then we have the hurricane a couple of weeks ago, and I was told by somebody yesterday that the hurricanes have tripled. We had 15 this year and last year, and it had been an average of 8 over the last 15 to 20 years from now. The energy business is located in or on the water worldwide. Nuclear power plants have to be on the water somewhere, somehow.
A lot of it's on fresh water, though.
That's neither here nor there if the hurricane hits you or the seas rise. But is it, really, this is not, I'm not trying to be the skunk at the party, but does it not seem strange to the three of you that, to my knowledge, climate change is not a part of the serious debate by public policymakers and industry on the issue of energy insecurity? Nothing could cause more insecurity to the worldwide energy business than climate change. Could it?
Well, I would like to turn to each of you in turn, but let me just start by saying thank you for the plug for Kevin Baumert's chapter, which makes a very, very strong case along these lines, and by the way, makes a case not just based on Kyoto, but post-Kyoto, what to do, and so forth. So that's one other area that I'm very glad that you highlighted, Weich. Thank you, and over to you, Charles, and then Robin, anyone else who wants to chip in.
Well, I think you're making a very good point, and I also think that it is seriously dealt with here in the book, and it should be on the agenda, but it's not my area.
Is it at the World Bank?
Oh, yes, it is. Yeah.
Very much so.
Climate change, very definitely.
There's only, you know, I'm sorry, but the skunk at the picnic on climate change is coal. And I don't know that there's that much attention has been spent on coal. I was just at a briefing this morning on China. The Chinese demand for coal, the Chinese demand for oil and gas is going up, but the Chinese demand for coal is almost insatiable. Do we have to deal with it? Yes, I think we do. I think that, you know, for the international oil companies, particularly if markets are tight, you tell them what they're supposed to do, and they've been pretty good at it. You know, the fuels are cleaner, they've eliminated lead, they've done a lot of things. But they have to have some stability and certainty. And I think, you know, there is no unanimity amongst oil companies, but I think you'll see that there are some real differences between companies and how they approach the issue. But I do think, I agree, it's a very, very serious long-term issue. But I think it goes back to this question of will, because if you want to deal with it, it involves pain. And I don't know about you, Weich, but a lot of politicians in this town don't find pain an attractive subject.
Including me.
Well, thank you. Any final comment? Looking at the clock, I'd like to do a few things. First of all, thank our panelists very much for an excellent panel in addition to the first panel, and to thank the audience and our other co-authors for contributing. I'll be turning back shortly to David for some concluding comments, but before I do this, I'd like to underline the message of these two panels in our book, that energy and foreign policy should go hand in hand. They should reinforce each other for the greater security of the United States and our partners around the world. And as we heard from so many, as Robin has reminded us, insecurity is more the name of the game today, but the challenge is to move from that state of insecurity to hopefully greater security. In our conclusion in our book, which I'm sure all of the audience has read very carefully, we did identify 5 major components for energy security, and I'd just like to mention them briefly by way of wrap-up. The first is, and because also it ties in very much to what we heard from our panelists, the first is to greatly increase the efficiency of our energy use, from auto fuel standards to concerted technology and alternative energy initiatives. The second component is to expand strategic petroleum reserves in the U.S. and internationally, and to agree through the IEA to use them to moderate capacity shortages. Third, we need to move to increase rapidly the world's capacity to refine oil and deliver gas by cutting back the regulatory thicket which strangles new refineries and deters regas terminals. Fourth, we must integrate our energy and foreign policies and promote transparency, democratic governance, and drying the swamp in which terrorism develops. We must both actively pursue peace in the Middle East and diversify to energy resources outside that region. Fifth, and this gets to the broader international environment, we must rid ourselves of unilateralist habits. The crisis of energy supplies and prices is upon us. Any measures taken just by the U.S., or in the absence of the U.S., will be inadequate or self-defeating, from hectoring the world's tyrannies to boycotting sensible international control of greenhouse emissions. The alternative, we think, is to engage the world's producers, the national and international oil companies, and to make common cause with the world's consumers in a true strategy of interdependence which can make all countries more secure. That's the alternative that's advanced in our book, both globally and in specific regions of the world. As I close, let me thank our editorial assistant, Riccardo De Vecchi, who did so much to help David and me to pull this project through. Riccardo, where are you? Please raise your hand. Thanks very, very much for all your help. And again, let me thank my friend, partner, and co-editor, David Goldwyn. David brought enormous intellectual energy, editorial judgment, and good fellowship to this project. Sometimes projects like these, as all of us, I think, can attest, are a strain to friendships. But in this case, it has really been just a big plus and just a tremendous pleasure. So thank you, David. And on that note, I will turn over to you to close the afternoon for us, after which we'll all get together for a reception.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you all for your patience here. I won't summarize everything we've heard today. I want to make one more recognition to Shirley Neff, who's joined us, who made an important contribution to the book, and thank you for being here with us. I don't think I've missed any of our other authors, but if I have, wave to me. Okay. We've tried to give you a sample today of some of the thinking that's in the book. It's quite diverse. We have Mr. Kaluzhny and Alatia, who take great issue with some of the things that Adam Szyminski and other people have to say. We have divergent views on the Alaska pipeline. But I think you've heard today a good sample, and a good sample of the things that are changing and the things that are going wrong. And I think a short list of those are OPEC's underinvestment, the peak by non-OPEC, demographic change in the Middle East, potential trouble in Saudi Arabia, China's growth, uncertainty in Russia. There's a lot of uncertainty everywhere, and then we've heard a few of the flashpoints, and those are just sort of a short list, which are potential conflict in Iran, insecurity in China, instability in Iraq, instability in Nigeria, we didn't talk very much about, and tensions in Latin America as well. And on the solutions, there's a variety of them, but they all do kind of cluster around the same issues, which is, do any of our political systems have the ability to see a danger in the future and do something about it? For the ones that have democratic accountability, can we actually hold our leaders accountable, be willing to accept pain when it comes our way and make change? And for the countries that don't have political accountability, but they have a civil society that would like to have change, are we on the outside willing to exercise the leverage we have bilaterally or through the IMF or for the World Bank to make a difference? And we get a C- so far. On our willingness to take pain, to have a gas tax, to make change, to do any of these things, to pay more for investment in energy budgets, or to use our influence overseas. We just don't do it so far. So I think when Jan and I set out to do this, we didn't know what it would take to do it, but we thought that the one contribution that we could make is to try and sound the alarm, to put some ideas out there, to help start the conversation, to inform the debate, so that our leaders, at least in this country, which have a huge influence on what happens around the world still, would have some ideas to work with and hopefully the courage to act. So we thank you for listening. We hope that they'll listen too. We hope that this will begin a conversation which many of you who are all experts in this field and participate in this field will carry forward. And we thank you for participating with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
That was great. Thank you.
I talked too much as usual. I apologize.